It was a cold, rainy night in early spring, and I was driving home from a weekend visit to my parents' house. The highway stretched endlessly in front of me, bordered by dark forests on both sides. I'd always loved driving at night, but something about that evening felt different, heavier, darker. I brushed it off, thinking it was just the rain and fatigue setting in. About halfway through my drive, I spotted a figure standing on the shoulder of the road, illuminated briefly by my headlights. It was a woman, drenched from head to toe, her hair plastered to her face as she held up a thumb for a ride. I slowed down instinctively, my moral compass tugging at me. She looked desperate, shivering as the rain poured down. I couldn't leave her there. As I pulled over, she jogged up to the passenger door and opened it, murmuring a breathless, "Thank you so much," before climbing in. She was in her late 30s, maybe early 40s, with sharp features and pale skin. Her clothes were soaked, clinging to her thin frame. She looked up at me with tired eyes and said, "I just need to get to the next town." "No problem," I said, forcing a smile. "I'm headed that way." The ride started off quiet. She sat stiffly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, staring straight ahead. I tried making small talk, asking where she was coming from, but her answers were vague. "Here and there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Something about her felt off. It wasn't just the way she avoided eye contact or how her hands trembled slightly. It was the way the air in the car seemed heavier, like a weight pressing down on my chest. But I pushed the thought aside. She was probably just cold and scared. We drove in silence for a while, the sound of rain pounding against the windshield filling the car. Then she spoke, her voice startling me. "Have you ever seen something you couldn't explain?" she asked. The question caught me off guard. Not really," I said hesitantly. "Why?" She didn't respond, just stared out the window. Her reflection in the glass looked distorted, almost unnatural. I shook my head, blaming the rain and my tired eyes. We were about 10 minutes from the next town when she asked me to pull over. "Here's fine," she said, her voice firmer now. I slowed down, confused. We were still in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by woods with no houses or lights in sight. "Are you sure?" I asked. "There's nothing around here." "Yes," she said sharply. "I'll walk from here." Reluctantly, I pulled onto the shoulder and stopped. She opened the door and stepped out, not even bothering to thank me this time. As she closed the door, she leaned down and said, "Be careful on this road." Before I could ask what she meant, she was gone, disappearing into the trees without looking back. I sat there for a moment, debating whether to follow her or just drive away. Something about her warning sent a chill down my spine. I decided to keep driving, figuring I'd done my good deed for the night. But a few miles down the road, I started hearing a faint sound, like someone whispering. At first, I thought it was the wind or the rain, but the whispering grew louder, more distinct. I turned the radio off, but the sound didn't stop. It was coming from the back seat. My heart raced as I glanced in the rearview mirror. At first, I didn't see anything, but as the car passed under a streetlight, I caught a glimpse of something in the back seat. A shadowy figure hunched over, its face obscured. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching against the wet pavement. Whipping around, I shone my phone's flashlight into the back seat. It was empty. Shaking, I got out of the car and opened the back door, searching for any sign of someone or something. There was nothing there, but the whispering hadn't stopped. It seemed to be coming from the woods now, faint and distant but unmistakable. I jumped back into the driver's seat and sped off, my hands trembling on the wheel. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, pulling into a brightly lit gas station. I sat there for a while, trying to calm down, telling myself it was all in my head. But as I glanced at the passenger seat, my breath caught. The seatbelt was wet, soaking wet, as if someone had been sitting there. And on the floor was a single muddy footprint, pointing toward the back seat. I never picked up another hitchhiker after that night. To this day, I can't explain what happened or who, or what I let into my car. But sometimes, when I'm driving that stretch of highway, I feel like I'm not alone. And every time, I hear her voice in my head, "Be careful on this road." It was the summer of 2018, and I had just wrapped up a 2-week road trip with my best friend, Jake. We'd been taking turns driving my beat-up old sedan, and by the time we hit the highway back home, we were both exhausted. The drive was mostly uneventful, long stretches of empty road and the occasional gas station. That was until we decided to take a shortcut through a less-traveled back road to save time. The road was narrow, winding through dense forest, and completely deserted. It was the kind of place where your headlights barely cut through the shadows, and the trees seemed to loom closer with every mile. Jake was driving, and I was half dozing in the passenger seat when we spotted him. A man standing on the side of the road. He was tall and thin, wearing a long trench coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured most of his face. In his hand, he held a small suitcase. He raised his other hand to thumb for a ride, his movements slow and deliberate. Jake slowed the car, glancing at me for confirmation. "No way," I said immediately. "This is how horror movies start." Jake smirked. "Come on, he looks harmless. Probably just needs a lift to the next town." I wanted to argue, but something about the man's presence made the words stick in my throat. Against my better judgment, Jake pulled over and the man approached the car. "Thanks for stopping," he said in a low, gravelly voice. "I just need to get to the crossroads up ahead." Jake nodded and unlocked the back door. The man slid in silently, placing his suitcase on the seat next to him. As we started driving again, I couldn't help but steal glances at him in the rearview mirror. His face was pale and expressionless, his eyes hidden beneath the shadow of his hat. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting on the suitcase as if it contained something precious or dangerous. "So, where are you headed?" Jake asked, trying to make small talk. The man didn't respond at first, and the silence stretched uncomfortably. Finally, he said, "Just passing through." That was it. No explanation, no elaboration. Jake shot me a look, but I just shrugged, my unease growing with every passing mile. About 10 minutes into the ride, the man leaned forward slightly. "You missed the turn," he said, his voice sharp. Jake frowned. "What turn?" "The one back there," the man said, pointing to the rear windshield. "Turn around. We're headed to the crossroads, right?" Jake asked. "This road leads straight there." The man didn't answer. Instead, he leaned back, his fingers drumming lightly on the suitcase. Jake and I exchanged uneasy glances, but kept driving. The atmosphere in the car grew heavier, the silence oppressive. Every so often, I caught the man staring at me in the rearview mirror, his pale lips curling into the faintest hint of a smile. I wanted to say something, to tell Jake to stop the car and make him get out, but the words wouldn't come. Then the man spoke again. "You shouldn't have picked me up." Jake laughed nervously. "What's that supposed to mean?" The man didn't reply. Instead, he leaned forward again, his voice dropping to a whisper. "There's something in the road ahead." Jake hit the brakes instinctively, the car skidding slightly on the gravel. My heart pounded as we scanned the road, but there was nothing there. Just the same endless stretch of asphalt disappearing into the darkness. "What are you talking about?" Jake demanded, his voice shaking. The man didn't respond. He just sat back, his hands tightening around the suitcase. That's when we noticed it, the sound. It started as a faint tapping, like fingernails drumming against glass. At first, I thought it was coming from the suitcase, but as it grew louder, I realized it was coming from outside the car. Jake turned on the high beams, and my stomach dropped. Standing in the middle of the road was a figure. It was humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too thin, its limbs unnaturally long. Its head was cocked at an odd angle, and its face was blank, featureless. "Drive!" I shouted, my voice cracking. Jake floored the gas, swerving around the figure. As we passed it, I could have sworn I saw it turn its head to follow us, its neck bending impossibly far. The tapping sound faded, replaced by the roar of the engine and my own panicked breathing. When I turned to look at the man in the back seat, he was gone. The suitcase sat there, perfectly still, as if it had never been touched. Jake pulled over, both of us too shaken to speak. I opened the back door and grabbed the suitcase, my hands trembling as I set it on the side of the road. "What are you doing?" Jake asked. "We're not taking this thing with us," I said, slamming the door. We drove the rest of the way in silence, too scared to look back. When we finally reached the crossroads, we found no sign of the man or the figure in the road. The next morning, I called the local police to report what had happened, but they dismissed it as exhaustion and nerves. To this day, I don't know who or what we picked up that night, but every time I drive past a hitchhiker, I feel a chill run down my spine, and I keep driving. It was late August, and I was on my way back from a music festival in Arizona. The trip had been incredible, good friends, good music, but by the time I hit the road home, I was completely drained. The drive would take me through the desert on a long, empty highway known for its isolation. It was the kind of place where you could go miles without seeing another car or even a single light in the distance. The first few hours were uneventful. The sun set behind me, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. As the sky darkened, I turned on my high beams and cranked up the radio to keep myself awake. The only sound was the hum of my tires against the asphalt. Then I saw her. A girl was standing on the side of the road, illuminated by my headlights. She looked young, maybe in her early 20s, with long dark hair and a simple white dress that fluttered slightly in the desert breeze. She was holding her arms tightly around herself, shivering despite the warm night air. I slowed down, my heart racing. What was she doing out here in the middle of nowhere? There was no sign of a car, no houses, nothing but miles of open desert. Against my better judgment, I pulled over and rolled down the window. "Are you okay?" I called out. She nodded hesitantly, her eyes wide and filled with fear. "Can you give me a ride?" she asked, her voice trembling. I hesitated. Something about her felt off, but I couldn't just leave her there. "Sure," I said, unlocking the passenger door. "Where are you headed?" "Just down the road," she said softly, climbing in. Her voice was barely above a whisper, and she kept glancing over her shoulder as if expecting to see someone. As we started driving, I tried to make conversation, but her answers were short and vague. She didn't tell me her name or where she was coming from, only that she needed to get away. Every time I glanced at her, she was staring straight ahead, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. After about 10 minutes, she finally spoke. "Do you believe in ghosts?" The question caught me off guard. I guess I've never really thought about it," I said. "Why?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned to look at me, her eyes wide and unblinking. "Sometimes they follow you," she said. "Sometimes they never leave." A chill ran down my spine. I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. "That's an interesting thought." She didn't respond, just turned back to stare out the window. The air in the car felt heavier now, like an invisible weight pressing down on my chest. I tried to focus on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. A few miles later, she spoke again. "There's something in the road." I squinted into the darkness, but I didn't see anything. "What are you talking about?" I asked. "Just ahead," she said, her voice urgent. "Stop the car." I slowed down, my heart pounding. The headlights illuminated the empty highway, stretching endlessly into the night. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by the darkness. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't moving. It just stood there, motionless, as if waiting for us to approach. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car came to a halt. The girl grabbed my arm, her grip ice cold. "Don't get out," she whispered. My pulse raced as I stared at the figure. It was still there, its outline barely visible in the dim light. I reached for my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. "Who is that?" I asked, my voice shaking. "It's not a person," she said. Before I could respond, the figure began to move. Slowly at first, then faster, its long limbs bending unnaturally as it ran toward the car. I threw the car into reverse, my hands shaking as I backed away. The girl screamed, covering her face with her hands. Just as the figure reached the car, it vanished. The road was empty again, as if nothing had been there at all. My hands trembled as I shifted into drive, speeding away without looking back. The girl was silent now, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. After what felt like an eternity, I saw a gas station up ahead. I pulled into the brightly lit lot, my heart pounding in my chest. "You'll be safe here," I said, turning to the girl, but the passenger seat was empty. I stared at the seat, my mind racing. She had been there. I was sure of it. The seatbelt was still fastened, and there was a faint indentation where she had been sitting. I got out of the car, searching the lot, but there was no sign of her. When I went inside to ask the clerk if he'd seen anyone, he gave me a strange look. "You're the only person I've seen all night," he said. I didn't sleep that night. When I finally got home, I did some research on the area and found a story about a young woman who had disappeared on that stretch of highway years ago. Witnesses claimed to have seen her hitchhiking, only to vanish once they gave her a ride. I don't know if it was her I picked up that night, but I've avoided that highway ever since. Every so often, when I'm driving alone at night, I feel a chill and glance at the passenger seat, half expecting to see her sitting there. And sometimes I hear her voice in my head. Sometimes they follow you. Sometimes they never leave. It was a foggy October night, and I was driving home from a family visit in a small coastal town. The route was long and winding, cutting through dense forests and stretches of desolate farmland. The mist was so thick it felt like I was driving through clouds, my high beams barely piercing the gloom. It was the kind of night that made you want to get home as quickly as possible. I was about 30 miles from the nearest town when I saw a figure on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fog, but as I got closer, I realized it was a man. He was wearing a leather jacket and jeans, his motorcycle parked a few feet away with one of its wheels half sunken into a ditch. He waved me down, his face obscured by a helmet. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. The man jogged up to my car, his movements stiff and uneven, as though he was limping. He tapped on the passenger window, and I rolled it down slightly. "Thanks for stopping," he said, his voice muffled by the helmet. "My bike broke down, and I've been out here for hours. Can you give me a lift to the next gas station?" I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to say no. But the sight of him standing there, drenched in fog and completely alone, tugged at my conscience. "Sure," I said reluctantly. "Hop in." He opened the door and slid into the passenger seat, the smell of engine oil and damp leather filling the car. As I pulled back onto the road, he kept his helmet on, staring straight ahead. The silence was heavy, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional crunch of gravel under the tires. I tried to make conversation to ease the tension. "So, where are you headed?" "Anywhere but here," he replied curtly. His tone made me uneasy, but I forced a nervous laugh. "Fair enough. What happened to your bike?" "Ran out of gas," he said. Then, after a pause, or maybe it just gave up, something about the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles whitening. "Tough luck," I said, trying to sound casual. We drove in silence for a few more miles before he finally spoke again. "Have you ever seen something you can't explain?" The question caught me off guard, and I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye. "I guess not," I said. "Why?" He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, almost a whisper. "You will." My stomach tightened as I stared at the road ahead. The fog seemed thicker now, swallowing the edges of the highway. The headlights reflected off the mist, creating strange, shifting shapes that danced in and out of view. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the tension in the car was suffocating. Then he asked me to stop. "Why?" I asked, my voice trembling. We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but trees and fog. "Just stop the car," he said, his voice firm. Reluctantly, I pulled over. The man sat there for a moment, his hands resting on his knees, before he turned to look at me. Even with the helmet on, I could feel his gaze, heavy and unblinking. "Don't keep driving," he said. "Turn around. Go back." "Go back?" I repeated, my heart pounding. "What are you talking about?" He didn't answer. Instead, he opened the door and stepped out into the fog. I leaned over, calling after him, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, his silhouette fading into the mist. I watched him walk back the way we had come until he disappeared completely. Confused and unnerved, I decided to keep driving. I figured he must have had a change of heart or realized he was close enough to walk to wherever he was going. A few miles later, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The same motorcycle was parked on the side of the road, its wheel still stuck in the ditch, and standing next to it was the same man, waving me down. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing. How was that possible? I had just dropped him off miles back. I stared at him through the windshield, his hand raised in the same desperate gesture as before. My chest tightened as he started walking toward the car. Panicking, I threw the car into reverse and backed up, my tires skidding on the wet pavement. The man stopped, lowering his arm as he tilted his head slightly, as if confused. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I hit the gas and sped away, the car roaring as it tore through the fog. My pulse pounded in my ears, and every shadow in the mist seemed to move. By the time I reached the gas station, I was shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. I told the clerk what had happened, but he just gave me a blank stare. "That road's got a reputation," he said finally. "You're not the first to see him." "What do you mean?" I demanded. He shrugged. "Some say it's a ghost. A biker who died out there years ago, always looking for a ride he'll never finish." I didn't sleep that night, and I've avoided that stretch of highway ever since. But sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night, I see figures in the fog and wonder if it's him, still waiting, still waving, still lost. And every time, I keep driving.